And we're live. So, hello everybody. This is Kristen. Hello. And my dog.
Hi, I'm Lisa without the dog.
And we are here to give you our review of Fangirl. So right here. And our September book. I'm gonna let Lisa talk for a second while I try to get my dog to stop barking.
Well, as you can tell, it's not just the humans in the audience that are very excited about the book this month. It is also other animals, including Kristen's dog. I think Kristen's house is just full of literary lovers over there. First her son from the last episode, and now the dog this time. Maybe we'll get your husband on the next time just to round out the family picture. So as Kristen mentioned, we are going to be chatting about Fangirl this month. I just tweeted out the link where you can watch us live. So if you have any questions or comments, especially if you've read the book or if you have comments about our questions or questions about our comments, you can tweet them to us. We'll be following the hashtag on hashtag #SAReads. So join in the fun, won't you? And let us know what you thought about the book. So I'm going to let Kristen get us started because she's the one who introduced the book to me to tell us a little bit about the book, and then we'll go from there.
So first I should add the author, Rainbow Rowell, is a friend of a friend, which is what got me interested in reading her stuff in the first place. So that's how I got introduced to her. But of course I adore it, and of course I relate to it because it's set in the Midwest, which is where I'm located. So it does have some relevance to me personally. But Fangirl is about two young women going off to college, one who is very introverted and one who is very extroverted, and they are twin sisters, and they are headed off to college for their freshman year, and the extroverted one is, of course, ready to embrace college and take it on. It applies for a different roommate and wants to live away from her sister and have different friends from her sister, whereas her sister, the introverted one, Kath, who is the main character of the book, has this idea that they're going to stay together and doesn't really want to live apart and really isn't that excited about going to college because it's all new and she's not a fan of change. So one of the things and the reason it's called Fangirl is that Kath writes fan fiction for a series that is very much like Harry Potter. It's Simon Snow, and who is of course, a wizard. She and her sister Ren have written fan fiction together, but Kath is kind of the main writer of the fan fiction, and so there's a lot of kind of switching back and forth for her about what is reality. Is reality this world that she's living in, or is it the world that she's writing in? Lisa, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that is probably something that I initially was attracted to with this book. And the introverted student talking about life happening on the periphery or something that happens peripheral to them was really fascinating for me. First of all, though, I was really intrigued, of course, shockingly, being MBTI certified and a bit of an MBTI nerd, about the introvert-extrovert dynamic. And the two characters are almost polarizing views of extrovert and introvert. There's some stereotype a little bit in there, but it really does explain the dynamic in a really obvious, sometimes over-exaggerated way. So talking about reality and how the introvert has this rich inner reality and the extrovert is projecting and wants this huge external reality is very common in our perception of extrovert and introvert and what that means. And to be frank, I thought a little bit about Kristen and I, and if we were going off to college together as sisters, it might be the two of us, and I'd be the one going, I've spent enough time with you, Kristen, I'm going to find my own roommate, and Kristen is off writing fan fiction and living in her own reality and is, equal parts terrified for me and happy to be rid of me. But that would never happen because we can't get enough of each other, obviously.
Exactly.
But the idea of having, go ahead, sorry, you wanted to say
something?
No,
I was just going to, one of the things I love about this book is I so identified with Kath in this book, ridiculously so. She takes most of her first semester before she actually goes to the dining hall because she's scared of the dining hall. And I
Yeah.
will admit here that I rode the bus the first day of class. It scared the crap out of me. I didn't ride it for another semester until it snowed so hard that I could not possibly walk to class. So I had to take the bus. And that, I mean, an entire semester went by before I rode the bus again. That's how scared I was of different things, new things.
Mm-hmm. And it's amazing to think about, the internal life or the peripheral life as a means to deal with that anxiety and to deal with that fear, because it's a reality that you can ultimately control, which is kind of where I saw the fan fiction metaphor going, because something like college represents this huge change, this huge disruption in normal, and I always say normal in quotes because who knows what that means anymore, but for them, like disruption in her normal or their normal. And now having a place, not just that you can escape to, like reading a book, which we do sometimes to escape reality, but reading something that you've written. So you've constructed this alternative reality that you can just escape to, but also you can bend according to your whim. And how, for me, I was almost of two minds about it. I love that idea in principle, but I was almost frustrated by it in practice. As an extrovert, I think, and owning the bias, that as much as it's neat to have your own internal world, and I'm certainly one who has that myself. You've all seen the stack of books. I've got another one sitting next to me for the end of our conversation. But also thinking of it as an escape almost in the not so good way. I won't say negative, but in the not so good way.
Right.
So there were points that I thought it was fascinating that she could construct this alternative reality and almost try out and experiment with things that she may want to do or want to be a part of or want to say or want to feel. But at the same time, there was the part of me that was like, you could just do it. Like, you don't need that. So it was an interesting duality to hold, like a story within a story, which is really her story, if that makes sense.
Right. And one of the things that happens in the book is that she struggles with her fiction writing class because she can't write original fiction. Like, she's so reliant on these characters that have already been created. And so some of that is her, I think, fear to really live her own life. You know, it's fear of her. She's molded these characters into something that she really wants, and that she really believes in, and she can go live in this fantasy world. But to really write fiction and to take something from her own life and mold it into fiction is so scary for her.
And that
So
was
it
weird
just,
for... No, go ahead.
go ahead.
I was just saying it's weird for me to think that when you have the ability to do that, it's scary, but there was also, I think, for her something liberating in a way, because you get to play out the reactions, you get to play out the scenario, and everything in fiction, as true to life as it may be, is never real life. And so everything that was happy could be really, really happy. And even things that were really, really sad or frightening or frustrating were almost romanticized in their negativity. So like this, the great heroic struggle with college, if you will. So as much as it was a struggle, as much as it was scary, as much as it was something that she didn't want to do or be a part of, even the struggle and the negativity was romanticized. And Kristen and I have talked about this a little bit with essay commits and just with other areas that, sometimes romanticizing those struggles can help, or writing about them can help anyway, or dealing with them a bit separately can help. But there's also the danger of thinking that these sorts of struggles and crises, as big or as small as they are, can be almost fictionalized in such a heady, beautifully prosaic way, when really sometimes life just sucks. And you can't, writing a fan fiction like life sucks, the end, isn't as much fun. So I was, again, of two minds about that. Like, I love it as a way of expression. I journal. I like reading as a way to think through things. But at the same time, I wondered about it as, falling too deeply in love with the struggle of a fake life, in a way.
Well, and I think, they do tangle with mental illness a little bit in this book. Her father is bipolar, and Kath has a lot of fears about that manifesting in her. And I think that the fan fiction is a way for her to escape from that as well, but she also recognizes it. Like she
Mm-hmm.
knows that she's more fearful. She knows that she's like she kind of calls it her little bit of crazy.
Mm-hmm.
At various times where she recognizes that her behavior is extreme. The fact that she doesn't go to the dining hall for the entire semester is extreme. The
Mm-hmm.
fact that she doesn't want to make new friends on campus is extreme. The fact that all she wants to do is write fan fiction is extreme. And she gets that that's problematic, but she keeps doing it.
Yeah. Which is, something that a lot of us can identify with, particularly when it comes to coping mechanisms. I've talked about with friends of mine before, we always talk about ignorance is bliss. And there's something to be said for being ignorant of your coping mechanisms, as healthy or as unhealthy as they may be. And there's also
Mhm.
something blissful about being ignorant of what your coping mechanisms are helping you cope with. That when you finally master that internal dialogue of, oh, this is why I'm doing this, because this is happening to me right now, and this is bothering me, or this is something I'm trying to avoid. It's so much easier when you can just avoid it and, eat the chocolate or go for a run. One is slightly more healthy than the other in terms of a coping mechanism, I guess. Um, but when you recognize it, then all of a sudden it's a harder job for you to try and not do it or to try to avoid the coping mechanism when it was such a habit and something that was really helpful. And fan fiction kind of falls in the middle there with writing. Like I said, it's probably healthier than a lot of other coping mechanisms in terms of output, but in terms of what it does to isolate you and to sort of take you away from other parts of life, it isn't as healthy. But for her to be able to recognize it, um, but still do it, I think speaks to an experience that we've all had and may continue to have.
I think one of the things that's interesting about this is we've got two very different personalities, Ren and Kath, and they're both freshmen, which we all deal with, our first year students. And Ren is her destructive behaviors are so much more external.
Mm-hmm.
She goes out, she starts drinking excessively, and so those are the students that we tend to see as our concerning students, right? Those are the ones that it's that squeaky wheel,
Mm-hmm.
and those are the ones that we address. And yet Kath is muddling through with just the same sort of problems. I mean, she's got a dad at home who's sick. She's struggling with reality versus fan fiction. She's struggling with her grades and her, adjusting to school. And we don't, but she does it all very quietly.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's harder for us to see that she's a problem, or that not that she's a problem, but that she has problems,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, and it's funny because there's been lots of discussions, particularly with my friends in residence life, and I don't claim to know much, of anything about that area. I lived on residence, which is the closest I can claim to have knowledge about
Hmm.
residence life practices. But there's always been lots of discussions about the quiet students and the ones that you don't see very often, and how they may be just as, if not more, in need of help because they're choosing to deal with something without it being shown and without it being obvious and sort of implicitly, whether this is true or not, but implicitly in that not wanting to invite people in. Like I almost saw Ren's drinking as like someone holding up a big sign like "Help me, I'm in distress,"
Hmm.
whereas the opposite with Kath was more, leave me alone, my distress is mine, and it's in here. And I almost wondered if her fan fiction was her attempt to externalize it in a slightly less flashy but still out there, help me, like maybe a smaller sign with not as much neon. Um, but
Right.
it is interesting because we've talked about how do you approach the quiet students, and if they don't show themselves to be in distress, how do you know? And then do we have to assume every child and every student and everyone who's quiet is somehow in distress, which is probably not the case. Um, but interesting to see that dynamic change a little bit. And like you said, Ren was very much the squeaky wheel. Um, but the thing is, Kath was still squeaking, just maybe only a few people heard. And were they prepared to deal with that? I don't know.
Right.
I love hearing the dog in the back. I
Yeah,
agree. I agree.
yeah, the dog is very excited. Um, but yeah, I think this, one of the things that I enjoyed about it is that it really, the book overall, it really made me just kind of think about how we work with students,
hmm
and like you're saying, like which ones are internalizing it and which ones are externalizing it, and how we
hmm
work differently with them.
Yeah. And for me, it was almost the extreme example of something I'm very passionate about, which is story and student stories. And anyone who knows me or follows me on Twitter or reads my blog, I use the story metaphor over and over again. I use it for assessment. I use it for student development. And again, this was another way of making a really extreme example of story. Like her writing the fan fiction was her way of writing
Hmm.
her story, in part. I mean, there are certainly lots of arguments that it wasn't her story, and we can talk about the word her and what that means. Um, but it was her way of setting up this ideal story. And how many times do our students do that? Not necessarily by writing fan fiction, but by drinking excessively, and that's their supposed story. How
Right.
many rough drafts, so to speak, are they writing? Um, and how long do those rough drafts last before they realize it's not good and they abandon it? I mean, even
Hmm.
as professionals, we do that. We move through different jobs, different careers. We keep writing different stories. To see which one fits, but then how much do we believe them? How important do they become to us and to our identity? Because this fan fiction wasn't just a story for her, it was her in a way.
Hmm.
So how much of that do we need to remember and be respectful of when students are presenting with different identities and identity development? And how are we being respectful of a story even if we don't agree with it or don't like what we read?
Yeah. Agreed. What she said. So yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have a ton more to say. It's a little bit shorter, I guess, version tonight, just because this is considered young adult fiction. It's pretty quick read, um, but I can't recommend it enough. It's a great book. Should we go ahead and talk our other books, or do you have more you want to talk about with this?
Um, Not really, except that I would say that when we talk about young adult fiction, there's actually a lot of good stuff out there.
Tons.
And Kristen is sort of my Sherpa into the land of young adult fiction. I mean, back in my day, it was Babysitter's Club. I mean, that
Exactly.
was my young adult
Sweet
fiction.
Valley High.
Yep, yep. I mean, I will say I was very invested in Marianne and Logan's relationship. I wanted to be Christy, but then secretly thought being Claudia would be cool. So that was my foray into young adult fiction. But definitely, it's interesting when you're a young adult reading young adult fiction, and then when you're an adult, and Kristen knows I use the term for myself very loosely. When you're an adult reading young adult fiction, what you take from it. But there are some really smart young adult fiction out there. Like
Absolutely.
there obviously is some that's about like boys and parties, and if that's your thing, cool. But there's stuff that is like this, where it's the college experience, but it's written in such a smart, thought-provoking way. So as Kristen said, if you're looking for a quick read, but that is still profound and engaging, we're hoping to maybe throw in a bit more young adult fiction into our repertoire. Just to sort of broaden things and to think about things from another perspective, because these young adults are our students, or will be our students anyway.
Right. This is what they're reading too.
Yeah,
So I
absolutely.
always look at it from that perspective as well.
Mm-hmm. So do you have other books on your
Well,
nightstand
speaking of
bookshelf?
young adult,
Ooh, I planned
I've
that
been
segue.
reading. Right, exactly. No, so when Twilight was published, and we're going to go back to Twilight, which was, let's just be honest, some pretty awful fiction. And yet I read them all, of course. Um, there was a series of vampire books that was out called Vampire Academy,
Mm.
which has this awesome, like she's a totally kick-ass female character in them. And branching off of those was another series called Bloodlines, which is by the same author. It's set in the same world, but kind of with some different characters in it. Again, awesome female character in it, which is what I love about these. The female characters are super strong. This one learns magic and starts using it, against the wishes of her parents and her kind of like tribe of people. It's hard to explain without telling you the whole storyline. But anyways, she does this because she has some very strong beliefs, and it's a belief that she's come to after being kind of brainwashed for her whole life. And so it's I don't know. I find them they're light, quick reads, but they're also really enjoyable because of the characters in them. So that's kind of my fluffy read for the month. How about you?
Well, Kristen knows this, but my birthday was last Friday. Oh my gosh. I've been 30 for like a week, and it's weird, and I'm not sure how to deal with it yet, but that's a whole other episode. But as part of my birthday celebrations, I had a bit of a birthday book bonanza, and I've just made that up because it sounded cool. But what I requested for part of my birthday celebrations was to visit an old bookstore, and there's one in a neighboring city that is like the quintessential old bookstore. There's an old man who has been there since time immemorial. It's packed to the gills with books without a lot of rhyme or reason. It smells fantastic. It smells like old leather and knowledge and a little bit of dust.
That sounds like heaven.
Oh my gosh, right? So that was part of my birthday, was meandering through there. And then at the same time, I am fortunate and it's slightly terrifying. I live across the street from a library, so I can see the library from my house. And the library also has a used bookstore with sort of like the odds and ends, like pulled from the library books that are all like $1 or 50 cents. So suffice it to say, I went a little crazy. But decided to only show you 3 of the stack of books that I got. But there are a couple that I've started reading or just other recommendations, none of which are actually student affairs type literature, but other fiction. So some of you also know that I had a 30 before 30 list, and one of those items on the list was a 52 and 52 book challenge. And because it's me and I like lists and goals, I have another list of goals, one of which for my next decade, so from 30 to 40, includes finally reading all of these Sherlock Holmes stories written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, only in part because Benedict Cumberbatch is gorgeous, only in part, and a good actor, but also pretty. So I went to the used bookstore and I found the best of Sherlock Holmes. I figured where it's best to start than with the best of. And this book is a collection of a bunch of his short stories, featuring Sherlock Holmes, with a really cool introduction that talks about the author and his whole point about wanting to kill off Sherlock and then the immediate backlash when he did kill Sherlock off. And I find that so fascinating that a fictional character could be so endeared to the public. So I'm going to start with the short stories and then move on.
So you also have to read the Sherlockian if you get a chance?
Yes, I did read it.
Did you read it? Okay, good.
Yeah.
Good.
It was really good. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So what Kristen's referring to, it's basically a mystery almost within a mystery, but they're kind of happening in parallel, one in the past and one in the present, both around Sherlock. Oh, so good. And neat that there are actually Sherlockian societies throughout the world that discuss and debate Sherlock stories. So the Sherlockian, definitely would recommend it. Found that one in the library and read it in like half a day because I was just really anxious to find out what happened. So definitely a good one. I'm kind of into short stories a bit more these days, partly because, as Kristen and I talked about, good, quick reads, but also the art of writing a short story is really fascinating, that someone can have a whole plot and a whole emotional arc in a few pages as opposed to a whole novel. So one of my favorite short story authors, and I'm probably butchering her name, but I'm going to say it's Susie, but there's a Z in the front, Susie Gartner. So this one, Better Living Through Plastic Explosives, the title alone should be intriguing enough to read. But she also has a collection called All the Anxious Girls on Earth, which I read as part of my 52 and 52. Her stories are equal parts hilarious, mildly terrifying, strange, funny. She has a very interesting way of looking at the world. Let's just say that. So when I found this one in the bin of like $1.50 books, I grabbed it. I'm looking forward to reading more about her and her stories. So it's a little bit fantasy, a little bit reality, but her reality is just very different from anybody else's. And the final one, because I said I would only limit myself to 3 for this episode, I don't know, Kristen, have you read Room? Did we talk about that?
Oh my gosh, so good.
God.
So good.
So I read this. This might be like a whole other conversation Kristen and I could talk about. I read this on my e-reader a while ago. And so, of course, I got the question, why did you buy it if you already have it on your e-reader? Because the e-reader doesn't smell like a book.
Yeah.
You can't hold the e-reader in the same way. Um, so this book is just as fascinating, but it's one of those books where you have to put it down and take a few deep breaths every once in a while. So basically it's about a little boy and his mom who are locked in a room, hence the title, by I guess you could say a criminal, a madman, and the story is told through the little boy's eyes, and the room is the only life he knows and the only place he knows, and he's trying to grow up and understand life while he and his mother are locked away. And the story unfolds that you understand that the mother has been kidnapped and has had this child and is living in this room. And it also goes through what happens when they're no longer in the room and what that means for this little boy. And just his view of things that we take for granted, outside that we take for granted, doing things on your own, social interaction, birds in the sky, I mean, just about anything. Like the frustration and the fear mixed with the wonderment of seeing the world for the first time, because for him the world is the room. So when he sees the world for the first time, it's jarring, but it's also fascinating to see how he views things. And it's written, I mean, on the front cover they talk about it being darkly beautiful, which I think is a perfect metaphor for the book.
Right.
Yeah. Like you want to reach through and hug the child, but you're also just terrified of going anywhere near him, which I think is the author has done a really good job with it. What was your take on that one?
Everything you said. I mean, it was just so, like, to even put yourself in the eyes of that child and view and to understand what's going on from his point of view. I mean, because it takes you a little bit to figure out what's going on exactly, and whether this is just some weird, like, play story that he's made up, or if it's really what's happening and all of that. It's such a good book.
Yeah, and to even just having him be happy at some point in a situation that I don't think any of us would find to be happy. Like there's a beautiful and fearful ignorance that he has, or innocence even, I suppose, not ignorance, of the world around him, and this implicit trust he has, yet still understanding that things aren't quite what they seem, and that maybe he should be more afraid than he is. But I remember with an e-reader, which is just as dangerous, with one of these scrolling through, like just wanting to know what happened, but then also wanting to read it again to really sit in some of that emotion and the way that the author writes about it. So a good read and a good multiple read, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
That's where I'm at for now. The other ones are in my sight line. Like there's another stack over there, which is dangerous, but we're working our way through. It's a tough life, essay reads, having to read.
I've got a few more that I read. One is another Rainbow Rowell book, which was Landline. It's her most recent. It's her first kind of fully adult fiction novel, and it was not. I'll admit it's not my favorite of her books. I think Fangirl is probably my favorite of her books. But it is still very imaginative and a great story. The story is that this woman whose husband has kind of up and left right before Christmas with their kids. She was supposed to go with them, but work interfered, as it always seems to do. And she calls him from the phone in her childhood bedroom and realizes when she's talking to him that she's talking to her husband before he was her husband, like back, I think it's 7 or 8 years before. And so she keeps kind of calling and trying to figure out, should they have ever gotten married? Does he really, is he really happy, and those sorts of things. And it's just kind of a little bit of a different story, but kind of a neat story. And just, again, with her characters, they're just so rich. There's no, like, good or bad. It's like all these full, all these layers of character for each of them that I just really appreciate about her books. So I read that one, which was fantastic. And then I read The End of Your Life Book Club. Have you read that one?
No, but I've heard about it.
Yeah. Yeah, it was great. Anybody who reads is going to like that one because they talk about books in it. So it's kind of hard to go wrong. But the author's mother has cancer, has pancreatic cancer, and so the doctors have told her basically that she's dying. And he goes with her to chemo and to different doctor's appointments. And they've always talked about books like his entire life, but they decide to start reading like the same books and talking about them a little bit more in depth. And so they have this book club of 2 people, and they go through various books. And as you're hearing about the books, you're also hearing the story of his mom's life, like what she's done with her life. And she's an amazing woman. I mean, she's traveled to Afghanistan and all over the place, and she's trying to raise funds for this library in Afghanistan, and is doing this despite having pancreatic cancer, stage 4 cancer, and so she's doing all that. She's been to the Philippines and worked in an orphanage there, and she was the first female director of admissions for Harvard. And so, like, all of this sort of stuff, I mean, just an amazing woman. And so you're getting to know, like, a little bit about her throughout the book, and then also kind of her views on these different books, which is just, so it was really interesting. And it gives you a good list of books to read if you don't already have a massive list like some of us. But, yeah, it was definitely a good read.
Cool. Well, I'm adding that to the list. I'll just walk over to the library that I can see from my window right now.
There you go.
So dangerous.
Exactly.
So dangerous. Well, I think,
it's all free.
Yeah, which is the good thing. I mean, as much as these were cheap, free is definitely better. And what I like is you can try out a lot of different books, and if you don't like it, you just give it back.
Exactly.
And then if you do like them, you order them on Amazon, and they come to your house, and it's a good day.
Right.
Oh, well, I think that's about it for us. Definitely a shorter episode this time around, but that's because we need to hear from all of you out there. So as always, if there are books that you are just dying for us to talk about, or if there are books that you want to talk about with us, if you're already sick of hearing the 2 of us talk about books, I don't know why you would be, but in the case that you are, we are always looking for guests. We are always looking for more people to add to our Essay Reads book club. We want to hear about you. We want to hear about what you're reading. We want you to tell us what we should be reading and what your colleagues should be reading. So you can always tweet us over on the Essay Reads hashtag, or tweet Kristen and I, and we are happy to take your considerations. We do this every month, and as much as we have a huge stack of books, we want to know what's in your stack too. So tweet
Absolutely.
us, email us, tweet at the Essay blog. Let us know what we should be reading and sharing. Let us know what wine goes really well with your books if you want to, because we're open to that as well.
Absolutely.
I'm just drinking alone tonight, but that's okay. Next time, Kristen. Next time.
I'll get there.
I know you will. Anything else, Kristen? Anything else you want to share?
I think that's it. If you've read Fangirl or you're reading it, please do share with us what your thoughts are or questions, and we'd love to hear from y'all.
Yeah. So we will see you. Wow, this month. See, we got to get better at that. I was about to say next month, but since we rolled over into October, we're just going by like a slightly different calendar, the Essay Reads calendar, which is always one day behind.
Yeah, pretty much.
So technically it's still September somewhere.
Right. So we'll
Australia.
see you in October, November-ish.
That's right. We'll see you in the next few weeks for another installment of Essay Reads. Thanks, everybody. Keep reading and have a good night.
Good night.
Night.